John, Reuters reported that the German defense company
Right.
Rheinmetall, yeah,
Yes.
has received a contract from Ukraine for supply of artillery shell and propellant
Yes.
charges worth tens of millions of euros.
Yes.
And they announced it on Tuesday, today. And
Yes.
the contract value will be reflected in the financial statement for the second quarter of 2026, and its completion is planned for the first quarter of 2027, next year.
Yes.
So this is I'm sure that many people are looking at these sort of news coming out and in Russia, and they feel they're somehow trapped in the policies toward Ukraine. Well, when you look at Russia today and different sort of mindsets talking to each other, somehow some people criticizing, some people coordinating with the administration, some people are none of, basically in the middle of these two. And do you think the Putin administration is getting to the point to think about the timeline of the war? Because the time is so important. They're talking about 2027. How many years do they want to, do they need to put an end to the war? Is that of concern for Russia, or they somehow feel that they can continue this war of attrition? Because this war is a war of attrition. It's not that much influencing the Russian society, that not so much, but it's basically the casualties on the battlefield have been reduced significantly, and the war is happening with the use of drone and all of that. And how, looking at the war basically militarily and economically, how does Russia see that?
Lots of different ideas you've given me and our audience there, Nima. The 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 war weariness is rising. The confidence in a short war is declining. Yes. If you if my family in Moscow are an indication of where I live in Moscow is an indication. The level of tension that's caused by drone attacks at night and the associated disruptions of internet, telephone, and so forth, increase psychological insecurity. And one shouldn't underestimate what that means. During the day, there are gasoline shortages and rationing in some parts of the Western Russia, starting especially in Crimea, but certainly throughout Western Russia. There's gasoline shortages. There's gasoline rationing. There's a change in the standard of gasoline to cope with the refinery shutdowns and the destruction of refineries. So there's psychological insecurity rising. There's inconvenience and nuisance and trouble and concern. All of these things are felt personally. And it's no longer appropriate to describe this form of warfare as pinprick. It's, as you said, attritional. Whose population can survive longest in this kind of war? Well, the Russian side will survive longest because the Ukrainian regime's prepared to fight a war without anybody staying alive. It's prepared to sacrifice its defensive lines in the Ukrainian east, and then move, as it loses one defensive line, it will move westward and reestablish new defensive lines, losing lives each time it moves. All of those things will happen without a significant improvement in Russian internal security, right? So all of these things build up into that particular combination I've spoken of before. Russian confidence, the Russian voter confidence in President Putin's leadership is correlated with Russian confidence in the Russian army. If the army is made to look, I'm not saying it is performing badly, it's performing as well as it can given its orders, it's marching orders from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President Putin. If the army is perceived to be succeeding on the front, but not protecting the interior, Russian voters will blame the administration, will blame President Putin, will blame the government, the governor, and so forth. They will vote much like American voters will vote. Their pockets, their immediate concerns, their security, their health security, and so forth and so on. So you have a situation which, from NATO point of view, from CIA point of view, from MI6 point of view, from all these points of view, fertile ground, vulnerable Russia. That's what they want to create, right? They want to create the feeling on Russian voters' part that nothing the Russian army can achieve in the Ukraine will protect their security inside Russia. That's their war aim. Now, you've asked me a bunch of questions about how that plays out, yes? And we can't answer the bigger question. We turn that, how it plays out, into blocks of time between now and mid-September, when the election takes place. The question is, how does the warfare that NATO, the US, and the Ukraine are firing at Russia affect Russian voter intentions? If it turns out to significantly threaten the majority of the ruling party, President Putin's ruling party, the United Russia, then President Putin, having committed himself at last week's party rally to United Russia, will have to try to save his majority. How can he do that? Well, one of the traditional answers that the Russian government has used since Boris Yeltsin came into power in 1990-91 is election fraud, rigging the vote. Roughly speaking, 5% election fraud each major presidential election can be expected if there's a severe contest of confidence. Can the presidency, can the Kremlin achieve 10% election rigging to save its majority for the United Russia Party? I don't know. If they can't, if there's a significant risk to the Kremlin of a loss that even heavy vote rigging will not achieve, will the Kremlin postpone the election? You see, that's a dramatic goal of the NATO-US side, the Ukrainian regime, the long-distance drone war. That's one of their military objectives. That's a political outcome of a military objective. So we've got to think in terms of, between now and September, what damage can be done to the Russian voting process that Russia is not already doing to itself. And that's a separate problem. The problem that President Putin refuses to solve is the very high interest rate policies of the central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina. That's self-inflicted. It comes from President Putin's determination to protect Nabiullina, to pursue policies deeply resented now throughout the economy. That's got nothing to do, relatively speaking, nothing to do with the war aims. But you combine US NATO war aims with Nabiullina policies, and you've got a very incendiary combination that can trigger very significant votes against the administration. So that's the immediate problem we're facing. And Putin is trying now to jawbone his way into public confidence. Well, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well. So if you go around the country asking people, if you ask Chelyabinsk region people, do they trust President Putin's promises to clean the air from the poison that the local oligarch Igor Zuzin has been dumping on Chelyabinsk for years? If you go to coal miners in Kemerovo and ask them what they think of President Putin's attempts to clean up the methane explosion risk in coal mines. Or you go to Irkutsk region and ask what they think of Putin's promises to guard the water level in Lake Baikal from Oleg Deripaska, the aluminium oligarch. You find loss of confidence based on the perception that President Putin's government is too tied to the Russian oligarchy to reflect Russian public confidence. Now, that's where you've got underlying domestic problems, which the US and the Germans, the British, French, and Italians, and so forth, all are attempting to exploit with drone warfare. That's a very, very difficult set of problems. And I don't pretend to be able to solve them or to suggest there's an easy way out, and neither an easy way out for opposition voices in Russia or for the United Russia ruling party or for the general staff or for President Putin himself.
Yeah. John, shifting the gear to the conflict in the West Asia, we know that today the two delegations are in, at least one of them is, the United States is in Qatar, and Iranian going to get there in 2-3 hours. They're going to get there. There would be no negotiation talks between the two sides. Basically, the issue in Qatar right now is the frozen Iranian assets.
Yes.
And the Iranian delegation going to be there. They said they're not going to negotiate. They're not going to talk. The American part said they're going to talk with the mediators, Pakistani government and Qatari government. And we have a new MOU between Israel and Lebanon, which is basically came to destroy the first clause of the MOU between Iran and the United States about Lebanon.
Yes.
And how do you see the negotiations between, or the talks, or whatever that we could be named, is how do you find that between the two sides, Iran and the United States?
Well, first of all, we went through this point-by-point MOU point-by-point last time, and we can do the same with the Lebanese MOU, or the Lebanese-Israel MOU in a minute. But let's start with who the negotiators on the US side are. Anyone who retains any belief that with Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner as negotiators, where there's no prospect of good faith negotiation on any point with them as the negotiators. I think the last time we suggested that Iran insist on negotiating with Vance, with Vice President Vance, not with Kushner and Witkoff. The problem is that Vance himself, as we've said before, has undermined the main points of the US-Iran MOU on the issue, for example, of releasing the assets that are currently in Qatar. Remember that both Vance and Trump have said that there'll be no release of Iranian assets from Qatar. That's the oil revenues that were earned by Iranian oil sales to South Korea, moved from South Korea to Qatari institutions under US control. The US side has said that contrary to the MOU undertaking to release funds, no funds will be released unless they're under US control. That Iran will not be permitted to spend its own money. It will be directed to spend its money in the US on food products and farm goods, and so forth and so on. It's a fundamental violation of the spirit of the MOU. But then we can see Secretary of State Rubio walking away from the MOU as simply saying it's a framework for negotiation. There are no commitments there. To be also clear about it, Pakistan and Qatar are allied to the United States. They're under US military protection, so to speak. They're hardly mediators. You have a lot of people relaying messages between two rooms. There's the notion of mediation here is an illusion. The issue really remains a military one. Can the U.S. dictate the future of Iran under military attack? Can the U.S. maintain its blockade so as it can enforce its version of the Hormuz Strait regime, the South Track, the South Corridor, close to the Oman shore? Can it stop the movement of vessels along the North Track, the North Shore, the way in which the Hormuz Strait has now been partitioned, much the same way that Syria was partitioned after the fall of the Assad regime? So now you have a US corridor in the Hormuz Strait, and you have an Iranian corridor in the Hormuz Strait. Can that system work? Well, the answer that the Trump, Vance, Kushner, Witkoff group insist on is no, it won't be allowed by the US. So we have a kind of war of attrition, and you have some folks saying that the US is desperately short of petroleum resources, crude oil production capabilities, and the US is under attritional pressure to release oil from Iran through the Hormuz Strait as quickly as possible. We don't get into how much pressure the US has put on Iran. Iran, too, must get oil out. It must enable its oil fields to empty their storages and continue to pump at their normal volumes into empty tankers and let those tankers go out to market. All of those things suggest there's attritional pressure on both the United States and on Iran. That means that each side has some interest in reaching short-term accommodations. Yes? So that's my long way of answering your question. In short-term accommodations, what can the current Doha round of talks produce? Can it produce continuing flow of Iranian oil out to market, which Iran must have? Can it produce some release of Iranian asset funds to meet the MOU conditions on that point without triggering the US indication? No money will be released unless the US controls it. In these situations, both sides are capable of reaching short-term accommodations, not long-term end-of-war accommodations. And so we come back to your point about the Israeli-Lebanon US MOU that was signed in Washington earlier in the week. I don't want to repeat much of what Elijah Magnier on your program said a few hours back. Speaking from Lebanese political point of view, pardon me, he pointed out how none of the provisions of the MOU are enforceable against Hezbollah. None of the provisions provide for a withdrawal of Israeli forces south of the Litani River. None of the provisions which the so-called presidency of the Ayun presidency has agreed to in Washington under US control solve the underlying conflict, and they don't change the underlying dynamics of permanent Israeli war against anyone who resists, and in Lebanon, that's Hezbollah. So that means a significant problem that it looks to me to be far more difficult to negotiate term for term in Doha than the issue of assets, the issue of movement of oil, the issue of the Hormuz Strait partition. Those things can be accommodated on a 60-day basis, pretty much the way the MOU is intended, for 60 days. But can the underlying dynamic of Israeli expansion into Lebanon, permanent expansion into Lebanon, with the destruction. The MOU that's been signed in Washington this week calls essentially for the destruction of Hezbollah. It refers not to Hezbollah by name, but non-state party actors for the total disarmament of that. Well, I don't need to go into the Lebanese politics of it. Basically, Hezbollah represents, roughly speaking, a third of the population of Lebanon and is well entrenched and well institutionalized in all levels of Lebanese government, Lebanese administration, from village to region to Beirut. So what this MOU represents is the liquidation of Hezbollah, and that's a war aim for the Israelis and the Americans. Can that be negotiated by Iran in Doha? No, it can't. What's Iran going to do about it? Well, we'll see.